I want you to watch someone's face change. That is what this video is. Underneath the financial forensics and the legal proceedings and the 8-month investigation and the $318,000 underneath all of it is a face. The face of a woman who has built a professional life on the trust of a community that believed completely in her. The face of a woman who walked into school every morning for 6 years and accepted the specific social credit that comes with being a special education teacher, the thank yous, the appreciation days, the parent emails about how much she meant to their child while doing something that I am going to show you in full detail. And the face of that woman in the moment she realizes that the 2 investigators standing in the hallway of her school know exactly what she has done. Watch it. Because that face, that specific, fractional, instantly controlled expression that crosses Carol Whitmore's features in the first 2 seconds of this bodycam footage is one of the most revealing things I have ever seen in 8 years of covering cases like this. 2 seconds. That is how long the real Carol Whitmore was visible in that hallway. After that, the teacher came back. The helpful professional. The cooperative community member. She smiled. She walked toward them. She said, in a warm voice, "Of course. Is everything all right?" Everything was not all right. And somewhere behind that smile, she knew it. Carol Whitmore had been stealing from a fund designated for children with disabilities for 6 years. $318,000, taken from a budget line that existed specifically to buy adaptive learning equipment, therapy materials, and specialist support for students who had no other way to access those resources. She had done it methodically, carefully, and with the specific professional competence of a person who understood the system she was exploiting because she was the person responsible for administering it. And she had done it while being, by every external measure, one of the most respected teachers in her school. Today I am breaking down the full investigation. The anonymous tip that started it. The 8 months of financial forensics that confirmed it. The bodycam footage from the morning investigators walked into her school. And the moment caught on camera when Carol Whitmore realized that the life she had built was over. The trusted teacher. Carol Whitmore had taught special education at Ridgecrest Elementary for 11 years. She held a master's degree in special education from the University of Northern Colorado. She was licensed in Colorado with an additional endorsement in adaptive physical education. Her personnel file, reviewed by investigators, contained 11 years of positive evaluations. Not one substantiated complaint. Not one formal concern raised by a colleague, administrator, or parent. She was the school's resource room coordinator, the teacher responsible for the individualized education programs of 23 students with documented learning disabilities, developmental delays, and other qualifying conditions under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Her students ranged from children with dyslexia and processing disorders to students with autism spectrum conditions and physical disabilities requiring adaptive equipment. She knew their files. She knew their families. She attended IEP meetings, advocated for resources, wrote progress reports. She was also the administrator of the Special Education Resource Allocation Fund, the school-level account through which the district channeled dedicated grant money for adaptive equipment purchases, therapy material procurement, and specialist service contracts. The fund existed because special education students have documented, legally mandated needs that regular instructional budgets are not designed to cover. The fund was Carol Whitmore's responsibility because Carol Whitmore was the person who understood those needs and could be trusted to direct those resources appropriately. That trust was the mechanism she exploited. Not the loophole, the trust. The specific, earned, community-validated trust of a person who had built a professional identity so thoroughly aligned with care for vulnerable children that the idea of questioning her resource allocation decisions felt, to the people around her, almost offensive. The life she was building. Carol Whitmore earned $68,400 per year as a Jefferson County resource teacher. That is a respectable salary for a Colorado educator and a reasonable income for a single person in the Denver metro area. It is not a salary that explains a $4,200 per month apartment in the Cherry Creek neighborhood of Denver. It does not explain a 2022 Land Rover Discovery, leased in her name, with monthly payments of $847. It does not explain the credit card record showing consistent high-end restaurant charges, multiple international trips per year, Barcelona twice, Tokyo once, 3 visits to Mexico City in 4 years, and a wardrobe that the inventory executed on her apartment during the arrest search described as extensive and consistent with significant discretionary expenditure. The gap between Carol Whitmore's documented income and Carol Whitmore's documented lifestyle is the foundation of this case. And the reason that gap existed for 6 years without triggering financial scrutiny is one of the most important procedural lessons this case has to teach about institutional oversight of small discretionary funds in public school systems. We will come back to that. First, let me tell you how it started. August 14, 2022. On August 14, 2022, 10 days before the start of the new school year at Ridgecrest Elementary, the Colorado Department of Education's Office of Inspector General received an anonymous email through its public tip submission portal. The email was 6 sentences long. It identified Carol Whitmore by name and position. It stated that the writer had reason to believe Whitmore had been using the school's special education fund for personal purchases. It named 3 specific vendors that the writer believed were fictitious. It provided no documentary evidence. It gave no indication of who the writer was. 6 sentences. Anonymous. No attachments. This is a category of tip that investigators approach carefully, because anonymous tips can reflect genuine whistleblowing, or they can reflect professional conflict, personal grievance, or misinformation. The OIG's protocol for anonymous education fraud tips requires a threshold assessment before committing investigative resources. Is there enough specificity in the tip to make a preliminary inquiry worthwhile? The answer in this case was yes. Because the tip named specific vendors. And a preliminary check of those vendor names against the Colorado Secretary of State's business registration database took approximately 12 minutes. None of the 3 named vendors existed as registered Colorado businesses. The case was opened on August 16, 2022. Jefferson County Sheriff's Office Financial Crimes Unit was notified on August 22. The formal investigation began on September 1, 2022, the first day of the new school year at Ridgecrest Elementary, with Carol Whitmore in her classroom working with students whose adaptive equipment funds were simultaneously being reviewed by a team of financial forensic investigators. 8 months of financial forensics. I want to walk you through what a financial fraud investigation of this type actually looks like, because the mechanics of it are both genuinely interesting and important for understanding the bodycam footage you are about to see. The financial forensics team began with the fund's transaction records, requested through the district's internal audit process. What they found, in those records, was a pattern that is recognizable to investigators who work educational fraud cases, but that had been invisible to the school's administrative oversight for 6 years. The Special Education Resource Allocation Fund receives between $47,000 and $62,000 per year from the district's grant allocation. Whitmore, as the fund's administrator, had authority to approve purchases below $5,000 without additional sign-off. Purchases above $5,000 required a secondary administrator's approval, which in practice meant the school principal co-signed the purchase order. Over 6 years, the transaction records showed 214 approved vendor payments. Of those 214 transactions, 94 were for amounts between $2,800 and $4,900, consistently just below the $5,000 co-signature threshold. That clustering of transactions at a specific dollar range just below an approval threshold is called threshold structuring in financial fraud investigation, and it is one of the most reliable indicators of deliberate evasion of oversight controls. Of those 94 transactions, investigators identified 61 that had been paid to vendor entities that did not exist in any state business registry, held no legitimate business address, had no web presence, and were linked, through a combination of financial record subpoenas and IP address tracing, to Carol Whitmore herself. 61 fictitious vendor payments. $318,000 over 6 years. Each one carefully structured to stay below the threshold that would have required a second set of eyes. Each one processed through an account she controlled, paid to a company she had created, for equipment and services that were never purchased and never delivered. And for 6 years, not one student received the adaptive equipment or specialist services that those 61 payments were supposed to fund. That money was gone into Carol Whitmore's Cherry Creek apartment and her Land Rover lease and her trips to Barcelona. By April 2023, the financial forensics team had built a complete picture. They had the bank records. They had the vendor registration documents. They had the IP traces. They had 6 years of false purchase orders bearing Carol Whitmore's signature. The case was ready for arrest. Why they came to the school? The decision to execute the arrest at Ridgecrest Elementary on a school day rather than at Whitmore's apartment was deliberate and procedurally documented. Investigators wanted to take possession of her school laptop, her physical files, and the contents of her classroom storage, all of which were likely to contain additional documentation relevant to the case. Executing the arrest at the school, with a simultaneous search warrant for her classroom and school office, allowed them to secure that material at the moment of arrest before it could be accessed or destroyed. The school principal, Marcus Webb, had been notified at 7:45 a.m. that morning, 90 minutes before investigators arrived, and had been asked to ensure student activities were structured to minimize the visibility of the police presence to the student body. Principal Webb cooperated fully. He had not been told the specific nature of the charges when he received the call. He found out at the same time his school did. Notice they signed the visitor log. An arresting officer signing the visitor log of the school where they are about to arrest a teacher. That detail stays with me. It is the kind of detail that captures something about the specific dissonance of this case, the way the ordinary institutional rhythms of a working school continued around an event that was about to fundamentally rupture one of the people inside it. 2 seconds. That is the window where the real information is. And I want to be precise about why, because this is the kind of footage analysis that matters. An innocent person who is surprised by strangers calling their name on a corridor reacts with open surprise eyebrows up, a slight startled backward lean, a genuine "oh, hi, what's going on" energy. What you see in Carol Whitmore's face in those 2 seconds is not that. What you see is recognition. Not recognition of the specific investigators, she has never met them. Recognition of what their presence means. You only react that way to unexpected strangers if somewhere in your mind you have been waiting for unexpected strangers to arrive. Watch what Callahan does when Whitmore suggests her classroom. She redirects to the conference room. Why? Because the classroom is Whitmore's space. It is the environment where she has professional authority and comfort, where she controls the geography and the social dynamic. The conference room is neutral space. It is also the location that minimizes the likelihood of students seeing or hearing the interaction. Callahan's redirect is simultaneously tactical and protective of the student body. Both considerations are present in that single sentence, and neither of them is accidental. The conference room, the interview you need to watch. Callahan opens the interview by explaining that the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office Financial Crimes Unit has been conducting a review of the Special Education Resource Allocation Fund in conjunction with the Colorado Department of Education's Office of Inspector General. She says this matter-of-factly, without inflection. And here is what I want you to watch in Whitmore's face when those words land. That is a trained investigator watching a performance. Callahan is watching Whitmore perform composure, and she is recording what the performance costs. A person with nothing to hide does not perform composure at the mention of a fund they administer. They feel composure because there is nothing threatening in the information. Whitmore is performing it because maintaining it has just become work. She offers to check her files. For vendors she has been paying for 6 years. For companies that, per her own testimony in the interview that followed, she had contacted directly and built ongoing professional relationships with. She would have to look up the contact information for companies she has worked with continuously for 6 years. Callahan notes this. You can see her note it. Her pen moves on her pad. She does not react visibly. She just writes it down. Watch Carol Whitmore in the next 4 seconds. Because the smile, the structural, performing, holding on smile stops. It does not fade gradually. It stops. The muscles that were maintaining it simply cease their work. And what is underneath is not the expression of a person who has just been confronted with a misunderstanding. What is underneath is the face of a person who has just heard, from a stranger in a conference room in the school where she works, the exact number. $318,422. The exact number. And the exact account. She knew in that moment that it was over. Not because the number was wrong. Because the number was exactly right. You only know the exact number if you have the records. And if they have the records, the bank records, the account traces, the vendor registration checks, then there is no version of this conversation that ends with her walking back to her classroom. Carol Whitmore sat in that conference room in an elementary school surrounded by children's artwork, and she understood, completely and finally, that the life she had built was done. The interview technique, what Callahan did and why. I want to go back through the conference room interview and break down the investigative technique, because what Callahan does in those 15 minutes is genuinely instructive, and I think understanding it changes how you read the footage. Callahan opens with institutional context, the sheriff's office, the OIG, the fund review before naming specific vendors. Why? Because she wants Whitmore to establish a position before she knows the investigators have specifics. If Callahan names the fictitious vendors in her first sentence, Whitmore knows immediately what they know and can calibrate her response. By describing the review first, Callahan creates a window in which Whitmore might either confirm information the investigators already have or make statements that contradict the documentary record. When Whitmore says the vendors are suppliers the school uses for quality adaptive materials, students really benefit from those resources. That statement is now in the recorded interview. It contradicts what the investigators know, that those vendors do not exist and no materials were ever received. It is not an additional charge. But it is a documented false statement made during a recorded interview, and that becomes part of the evidentiary picture. The request for vendor contact information, where you source them, who the contact people are, is designed to produce a specific kind of evasion. An innocent person with real vendor relationships provides a name, a phone number, an email, a website. A person whose vendor relationships are fictitious says they would have to look it up. The evasion is documented. The documentation is evidence. And then the disclosure, the exact number, is the close. Callahan is not asking a question she does not know the answer to. She is presenting the conclusion and giving Whitmore the opportunity to respond. This is called a confrontation interview technique, and it is used when investigators have sufficient evidence to charge and want to give the subject one opportunity to provide a version of events before arrest. Whitmore's response, 7 seconds of silence, then "I'd like to speak to an attorney," is not a response that helps her. But it is the legally correct one, and Callahan acknowledges it immediately and without any attempt to continue. Miranda and the handcuffing done right. The Miranda warning at 9 hours 33 minutes and 11 seconds was given in full and in the correct sequence before any further questions, immediately at the point of arrest. Whitmore invoked her right to counsel and questioning stopped. Completely. Callahan and Okafor did not continue the conversation. They did not make comments intended to elicit responses. They processed the arrest in silence, which is exactly what the law requires. The handcuffing was executed in the conference room rather than in the corridor. This is a judgment call that reflects both tactical consideration the conference room is contained and, I think, a degree of professional awareness of where they were. They were in a school. There were children in classrooms on the other side of those walls. Executing a visible, dramatic arrest in a hallway full of student artwork is not necessary, and Callahan chose not to do it. The escort from the building was calm, professional, and as visually low-key as an arrest of a school employee can be. That does not mean Carol Whitmore was not arrested. She was arrested. She was handcuffed in a school conference room. She was walked out of a building where she had worked for 11 years past a front desk administrator who had greeted her every morning of those 11 years. None of those facts were softened. But the procedural execution was measured and correct. IEP students and the fund they depended on. I want to spend some time here on what the Special Education Resource Allocation Fund actually was and what it was supposed to do. Because the specific nature of what Whitmore stole from matters, and I do not want it to get lost in the numbers. An individualized education program is a legally mandated document under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Every student in a U.S. public school who qualifies for special education services by reason of a documented disability that affects their educational performance is entitled to a free, appropriate public education that addresses their specific needs. That entitlement is not aspirational. It is federal law. It creates specific, enforceable obligations on school districts. The Special Education Resource Allocation Fund at Ridgecrest existed to meet specific obligations outlined in specific students' IEPs. The fund was supposed to purchase adaptive keyboards and tablet mounts for students whose physical disabilities limited their ability to use standard equipment. Sensory materials for students with sensory processing conditions. Specialized reading software for students with dyslexia. Therapy putty and fine motor development kits. Social skills curriculum materials. Augmentative communication device accessories. These are not luxury items. They are tools that specific children needed, that their IEPs said they should have, and that their parents had been told they would receive. Some of those students did not receive those tools because the money allocated for them went to Carol Whitmore. The post-arrest investigation included a comprehensive review of each of the 61 fraudulent transactions against the IEP records of Whitmore students during the relevant period. The review identified specific instances where equipment listed in a student's IEP as approved for purchase and apparently purchased, per the fund records, was never received. Parents had been told the equipment was on back order, or that the vendor had shipping delays, or that the budget cycle required waiting until the following semester. Those explanations, delivered by Carol Whitmore in IEP meetings and in emails to families, were lies. 2 years. A child with a documented physical disability waited 2 years for an adaptive keyboard that his IEP said he needed and that had been purchased on Carol Whitmore's account. That specific child, in that specific 2 years, had to use standard equipment that his disability made difficult to operate effectively. Every day. That is what $318,000 of stolen special education funding looks like when you translate it from a financial forensics spreadsheet into a child's school experience. It looks like a second grader spending 2 years struggling with a keyboard he cannot use well, while his teacher drives a Land Rover and books flights to Barcelona. The search warrant. A search warrant for Carol Whitmore's Cherry Creek apartment was executed simultaneously with the school arrest on the morning of April 3rd. A separate warrant covered her school laptop and classroom files, which were seized at Ridgecrest. The apartment search produced the physical and digital evidence that completed the prosecution's picture. From the apartment, bank statements for 3 accounts, her primary personal account, and 2 accounts held in the names of 2 of the fictitious vendors, both of which were accessible via her own credentials and her own devices. A laptop containing the email accounts used for the fictitious vendor registrations and correspondence. A folder of fake vendor letterhead documents professionally printed, with logos and addresses, designed to look like legitimate business communications if a purchase order was ever questioned. The fake letterhead. I want to stay on that for a moment, because it tells you something about Carol Whitmore's level of operational planning that is distinct from opportunistic fraud. Opportunistic fraud, someone who sees a budget they can access and takes money because the oversight is weak, does not create fake vendor letterhead. You only create fake vendor letterhead if you are planning for scrutiny. If you are preparing for the moment when someone asks to see documentation. If you have a long-term strategy that accounts for the possibility of questions. She was not caught because her fraud was sloppy. She was caught because an anonymous tip gave investigators a specific enough lead to pull the thread. Without that tip, the investigation's entry point is unclear. The oversight failures in the district's fund administration, which the OIG report documented in detail and which resulted in new audit protocols for every school-level discretionary fund in Jefferson County, had not generated any internal concern in 6 years. The aide at the doorway. I keep coming back to her face in this footage, because she is a person who has worked alongside Carol Whitmore in that resource room, serving the same students, doing the same work, and she is looking at investigators going through that space, and she does not yet fully understand what it means. She will. And what it means, when she understands it, is going to be a specific kind of professional disillusionment that takes a long time to process. What she was charged with. Carol Whitmore was charged with 12 counts, 6 counts of theft from a government program exceeding $100,000 in aggregate value, 3 counts of computer fraud in connection with the creation of fictitious vendor accounts and email identities, 2 counts of forgery related to the fake purchase orders and vendor letterhead, and 1 count of criminal impersonation in connection with her operation of the fictitious vendor entities under false identities. Let me break down the lead charge, because it carries the weight of the case and understanding it is important. Theft from a government program, specifically a federally funded educational grant account, is prosecuted as a federal crime under 18 U.S. Code Section 666, which covers theft from programs receiving federal funding. When the stolen amount exceeds $5,000 in any 12-month period, the charge carries a maximum of 10 years in federal prison. In Whitmore's case, the theft was sustained across 6 years and totaled more than $318,000. The federal exposure was significant. She was also charged under Colorado state law with aggravated theft in computer crime statutes, reflecting the dual federal and state jurisdictional dimensions of a case involving both federal grant funds and state school district resources. The plea and the sentence. Carol Whitmore entered a guilty plea in Jefferson County District Court on September 14, 2023, 5 months after her arrest. The plea agreement resolved all charges under a negotiated arrangement. She pleaded guilty to 2 federal theft counts and 1 state forgery count, with the remaining 9 counts dismissed in exchange for her cooperation with the OIG's broader review of district oversight failures and her full financial disclosure for the purposes of restitution calculation. Sentencing was held on November 29, 2023. The sentencing judge, the Honorable Patricia Moreno, delivered remarks that are worth quoting at length, because they articulate the specific nature of this case's harm more precisely than any news coverage of the sentencing did. Carol Whitmore was sentenced to 7 years in federal custody, with full restitution of $318,422 ordered as a condition of any supervised release. She was permanently barred from working in any capacity with a public school district or any institution receiving federal educational funding. Her Colorado teaching license was revoked by the State Board of Education on the same day as her guilty plea. She is currently serving her sentence. She has made no public statement. The oversight gap that made this possible. I want to close with something that the news coverage of this case almost entirely missed, because I think it is the most practically important thing this case has to teach. Carol Whitmore stole $318,000 over 6 years from a fund that had annual external audit requirements. The Jefferson County School District completed annual audits of its school-level discretionary funds during every year of Whitmore's fraud. Those audits did not detect the theft. Why not? The OIG's post-investigation report examined this question in detail. The finding was not that the auditors were negligent in a simple sense. The finding was that the audit process was designed to detect mathematical discrepancies to confirm that the total of approved purchase orders matched the fund's expenditure records. And in Whitmore's case, the purchase orders did match. The fictitious vendors had fictitious invoices. The invoices matched the purchase orders. The purchase orders matched the fund records. Mathematically, the books balanced. What the audit process was not designed to detect was whether the vendors were real. Vendor verification confirming that the entities receiving public money were legitimate registered businesses providing legitimate services was not part of the standard audit protocol for school-level discretionary funds in Jefferson County prior to this case. It is now. The OIG report resulted in mandatory vendor verification requirements for every discretionary fund in the district, an expanded audit scope that includes business registration checks for all fund payees, and a secondary approval requirement for all payments above $1,000 down from the $5,000 threshold that Whitmore had exploited. Those changes are the structural legacy of this case. They will not return the $318,000 or give back the 2 years that one child spent without his adaptive keyboard. But they will make the same fraud substantially harder to execute in Jefferson County going forward. The anonymous tip and what it represents. The case was opened by 6 anonymous sentences. I think that is worth dwelling on for a moment. Someone who knew enough about what Whitmore was doing or suspected enough to name specific fictitious vendors sent a 6-sentence email to the OIG tip portal and gave investigators the thread they needed. We do not know who sent that email. We do not know how they knew. The investigation did not pursue the tipster's identity, and the OIG's anonymity protections for complainants means that identity may never be public. But whoever sent that email looked at what was happening to the fund they knew was supposed to serve specific children, and they decided that it was not acceptable to simply observe it and say nothing. 6 sentences. An anonymous submission. And $318,000 worth of fraud was uncovered. If you are ever in a position where you believe public money designated for vulnerable populations is being misused, whether in a school district, a healthcare setting, a social services agency, know that the reporting mechanisms exist and that they work. The Colorado Department of Education OIG tip portal is public and anonymous submissions are protected. Every state has an equivalent. Every federal department with educational or social service funding has an inspector general with a public tip mechanism. 6 sentences is enough, if the 6 sentences are specific enough. Carol Whitmore is serving 7 years because someone wrote 6 sentences. The children of Ridgecrest Elementary are served by a fund with stronger oversight because an institution was forced, by a criminal investigation, to look honestly at how its oversight had failed. Neither of those outcomes is complete justice. But both of them are real, and both of them matter. That is the full Carol Whitmore case. From an anonymous 6-sentence tip to 7 years in federal custody. And I want to say something before we get to the end of this. The moment that I keep returning to in this case is not the arrest footage, as significant as that footage is. It is the parent testimony, the quote from the father of the student who waited 2 years for an adaptive keyboard that his IEP said he needed. I trusted her completely. I had no reason not to. That sentence is the whole case, condensed. Trust extended to a professional who had positioned herself as an advocate for the most vulnerable students in her school, and who used that trust as the cover for 6 years of theft. The children she stole from could not report what was missing because they did not know what they were supposed to have. Their parents could not report it because they had been told the delays were systemic rather than personal. The institution could not report it because its audit process was not designed to look for what she was doing. The only person who could see it clearly enough to report it was whoever sent that anonymous email. And they did. If this video gave you something, if you are walking away from this understanding something you did not understand before, please hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Every video on this channel is built to this standard, documented, accurate, deep, and honest about what it does and does not know. The like button matters for reach. The Patreon in the description matters for the research time that makes depth like this possible. Drop a comment below. Tell me what part of this case hit you hardest. The Bodycam moment in the corridor? The number $318,000 and the 6 years of it? The parent testimony? The sentencing remarks? The anonymous tip that started all of it? I read every comment. Take care of yourselves. Look out for the people in your communities who depend on others to advocate for them. And I will see you in the next one.